Tim Linder here. Let's talk about image adjustments and adjustment layers. This one's pretty important. I mean, if you've got a choice of maybe taking your heart medicine right now or watching this video, that's a tough one. You might want to talk to your doctor. So if you look at this image that I've got right here, one of the problems that you might run into is that maybe it just doesn't pop, right? It's kind of gray. Maybe you like that. Maybe that's what you were looking for. All of these image adjustments that I'm going to show you, it's really kind of a lot of it is your choice as a photographer or as somebody working digitally here to adjust these images to get what you want out of them. So in this particular image, maybe I want to adjust the color a bit. So if I were to go to image adjust, I see all these image adjustments. The same image adjustments, just about, not all of them, I'll show you a few of them that aren't in there, but the same image adjustments that I've got are also pretty much over here. I'm going to pull this layer panel out so that we can see this pop up here. Adjustment layers, okay? So over here, that same list, those same things that you'll find here, solid color, gradient, pattern, levels, curves, all those, same thing over here, just about. Image, adjust, levels, curves, exposure, variance, very similar list. So I could come in here on this side and choose brightness and contrast, and I can adjust the contrast of this image or make it a little bit brighter if I wanted to, get some of the detail back in and choose OK. But that's kind of a destructive way of doing it. If I've made this really bright, I've lost any detail in the sky that if I later want to say, you know what, I want to go back and change that, image, adjust, brightness and contrast, and I want to go back down. I got rid of a lot of that information when I made it really bright. Any information that in the sky is gone or any contrast. So this is not the best way to go about making adjustments over here in the image adjustment panel. Sometimes it's your only choice, but I'm going to go over here to File, Revert. I'm going to revert back to my original image. A better way to go about this might be to go over here and choose an adjustment layer. So if I go over here and I say brightness and contrast from this method, notice it creates an adjustment layer over the top of this image, and then in my properties panel that pops up, I get my ability to adjust my brightness or my contrast if I want to adjust from here to get a little bit brighter or a little bit darker if I wanted to. And now if I ever want to go back and make a change, I could go back and make a change with these sliders and just get back to where I was before. I haven't lost any information. It's non-destructive. Non-destructive editing is the way that we want to work in Photoshop most of the time if we can, so that we can, we're not destroying our image. We can always go back and make a change if we want to. Now, these adjustment layers can be layered over the top of one another. So I could grab a brightness and contrast adjustment, and then I could come in here and say, oh, give me a hue and saturation adjustment, and I could adjust that similarly, and they ride on top of one another, right? And I can turn them on and off if I wanted to. I could go back in and get my hue and saturation and make a change if I wanted to, a little far there. But I could make it cool or dark or green or however I wanted to. I can also stack these differently in the order at which that I want them to apply. So these are your adjustment layers, non-destructive, very similar to or often identical to what you've found over here on this side that I could turn it on and off and go back. So I'm going to go back to File, Revert yet again and start over. So you saw I used brightness and contrast. Really for this image, a better way of going about doing something like this would be levels. Levels is a great adjustment layer, a great adjustment to make, because you're doing it visually with kind of a graph or a histogram or a chart over here rather than just eyeballing it. And you're always eyeballing it if you're eyeballing it on any kind of screen. Who knows what that screen is, set to. Your image on your monitor, you're looking at the same image might look a little bit different. So if you're looking at a chart, you're maybe doing it a little bit more intelligently in my properties panel. And I could look over here from left to right. This is kind of a mapping of all the light and dark images, light and dark pixels in this image. And I can see, okay, these are all the dark pixels over here, and these are all the light pixels over here. There's nothing that's really pure white. So if I were to drag this slider over here and say, make the pixels that are right just before this, make those pure white. I got some pretty good contrast. I get still not losing any detail. If I go too far, I'm blowing things out. And now all this stuff that was over here that were kind of bright pixels, they all got mapped to pure white, and I've kind of lost that. Maybe that's what I wanted to do, but now I can bring that back, and these kind of light gray pixels are brought back in. So I could go here and I can know, okay, intelligently, I'm dragging these two sliders in, and now I've got some pure black and some pure white and everything in between. So I've intelligently made this contrast. I could also hit the auto button, which would do the same thing, or I could select my gamma kind of in the middle and take the midtones and brighten those up or darken those if I wanted to with this little slider. So that's one thing that you can do with a levels adjustment in your levels panel. Again, turning that on and off and making these adjustments if I've got an image that's kind of gray or something like that. Now, I can also work with it in individual colors. So if I had an image like this and I came in and I said, oh, it's taken underwater, it's got a little bit of a blue hue to it here. The temperature's off just a little bit. If I go in here and I get my adjustment layer and I say, okay, give me the levels adjustment, I could choose auto and see what that does. Auto didn't really do anything for me there, so let's go and take a look and see what I can do. So instead of doing overall, I've got a nice darks to lights. There's pure black in here, it looks like, and some pure white. So this histogram goes from side to side. But let's look at individual colors. RGB, red, green, and blue. And I say, okay, boy, I got all these colors over here that, maybe I want to drag my red histogram so I get a more of a broad range of those reds, and I could slide this back and forth to get a little bit warmer or cooler if I wanted to. And I go check my green and maybe do the same here. Drag this in just a little bit, drag these over, and go to blue, and that one looks pretty good. But now, as I look at this levels panel, it's kind of gotten rid of that blue hue to the whole thing as I drag that back and forth, and I did it intelligently with this histogram and dragging those sliders around, so I could do something like that. I could also take the whole thing if I wanted to and say, oh, I'm going to grab here and go to color balance if I wanted to, and I just turn the levels adjustment off that I did, or I could trash that if I wanted to. And I could say, okay, overall, I'm just looking at this thing. I know it's a little bit blue, so I'm going to take my midtones and move those a little bit more toward red and move magenta a little bit away from green, and maybe I'll do the same with highlights and move those a little bit. And so I can kind of eyeball it with these adjustments here to make my adjustment. But to be honest, I feel like you're just kind of eyeballing it here. When you're doing it with the levels panel, you're doing it a little bit more intelligently and looking at the histogram in order to make that change. So that was what your levels panel. Some adjustments you won't find in the adjustment panel. So these adjustments over here in adjustment layers, you won't find them over here. Like I'm not even seeing the whole list there. I'll make sure I drag it up here so you can see it all. But I don't see things like shadow highlight over here, right? See things like invert. I can invert the whole thing, and that's not really just a setting. It's just one or the other inverted if I wanted to make it look like an X-ray or something like that. Or I could go to posterize and adjust how many colors this thing's kind of broken down to if I wanted to. But I don't see shadow highlight. Shadow highlight's a great one that I don't necessarily see in that pull-out menu, but is over here. So if I go to image adjust and I see shadow highlight, I can work with the shadows and the highlights differently. So I notice in this example, if I turn this all the way off, I notice that as I drag this slider back and forth, notice how it's really working with only the shadows or only the highlights. So if I say, okay, I want to get some of the detail back in the highlights, I could use this slider if I wanted to. Or if I say, okay, I'm going to bring up just some of the detail in the shadows, bring some of that back, I can do that. And I could choose okay. But again, I've lost that data, or it's doing that destructively. So maybe what a better idea would be is I undo that is if I take this and just duplicate this layer. That way when I go in and I do image adjust and do shadow highlight and make those changes however I might decide, it's not doing it with my original layer. I always have that original go back to. I could do something like that. So that was image adjust. Now I could also go in and let's say take some of these options and look in here, and there's really interesting and explorative ones that you can choose from. If I choose over here and say, oh, let's say I wanted to create a threshold, right? So this would be a threshold where maybe I wanted to create a screen print or something like that, where I only have pure blacks or pure whites or something like that I create. Either the pixel is all black or all white. I could create something like that. So that would be under threshold there. I could also go under here and I could choose gradient map, and I can map a gradient on it. We'll work with gradients a little bit later in another tutorial, but I could choose from a lot of different gradients in here if I wanted to. Grab some blues here, and it maps a gradient on that image if I wanted to. So the darks to light, I could create this sort of gradient, right? So I could also go in here and choose things like hue and saturation. I could go in here and grab hue and saturation. I could adjust these images, and I could also make some choices here too. And I could say, okay, let's only do the yellows. Let's only adjust the yellows, and notice that it's only adjusting the yellows in the hue and saturation slider, not the entire image. I could also change this image to black and white if I want to, and get some really good control over what's turned bright white and what's turned darks and grays and those sort of things. So if I went in here and say, all right, let's change this to a black and white image, I could do that. But I also have all these choices in my properties panel where I can say, all right, let's make the red plants a little bit darker. Let's grab those yellow plants and make those a little bit darker too. And let's take that sky and really kind of brighten it up and maybe almost eliminate it altogether. I lost a little bit of detail in those lights. So I have a lot of control over my ability to change something in darks and lights and black and white with my adjustment layer here. So these are some adjustments you might like to make with color or tone in your image. And again, it's best to use the adjustment layer if you can. Now, one last thing with the adjustment layer that's really great is that if I were to grab another layer, let's just grab some type here. I think I did this in another tutorial one. So I've got this trees typography. Notice if I grab my adjustment layer and I put it at the very top, it's going to affect everything that's underneath it. So my adjustment layer not only affects the layer that I create that's right above it, but everything underneath it. And if I only want it to affect the thing that's directly below it, if I hold my Option key down and I click on this little line right in between these two, now my adjustment layer only affects the layer that's directly below it. It's only tied to that one. So notice that was red. I could adjust that there. So if I wanted to undo or break that, I could hold the Option or Alt key and click on that. Now that adjustment layer affects everything underneath it as I drag it around, or if I eliminate it altogether or hide it, it will not have any effect.